The footage is ordinary. A gym on a bright June morning, mats on the floor, a young woman filming her own workout for a training course. 23-year-old Molly McLaren has done this every day for weeks. Then a man climbs the stairs behind her, 2 at a time. He reaches the open door, sees her, and turns back down. Seconds pass. He comes up again, and this time, he walks in. That man is 26-year-old Joshua Stimson. 2 weeks earlier, Molly had ended their relationship. He had not accepted it. For days, he had been planning, buying, watching. By the morning of June 29th, 2017, he had settled one thing in his own mind, and it was not something Molly could see on her camera. She keeps filming. He picks up a mat and starts to stretch, close enough to touch her. She stops, walks over, and asks him a simple question. Why is he there? Why is he not at work? He tells her it is none of her business. What Molly does not know is what is already sitting in his car in the park below. What her mother does not know is that the calls have already started. And what none of them know yet is that this footage, filmed by Molly herself, is the last clear record of her alive. They met the way a lot of people meet now. A swipe on a phone, a match on Tinder on the last day of July, 2016. He lived 7 miles away, in Woodham near Rochester, close enough to be convenient, and, later, close enough to be a problem. At first, he told her things that made her feel understood. He said he had struggled with his mental health, that he had bipolar disorder, that he knew what it was to fight your own mind. Molly had fought hers too. She recognized the language of it, and she trusted him with it. The thing is, the diagnosis was a lie. Joshua had never been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He built it out of nothing, a story he could tell to pull sympathy toward himself, and it worked. It was the first of many tools, and he would reach for it again and again, always at the moment Molly tried to step away. They met in person that November. Over the weeks that followed, they spent more and more time together, and Molly told her friends she was falling for him. It was her first proper relationship. She wanted it to be good. But then her friends started to notice the way he was. He did not try to know them. He did not seem to want friends of his own. And when Molly needed a night, an afternoon, an hour to herself, he treated it as a theft. After one weekend where she studied while he sat around her house, he messaged her that it was unfair. Him wasting hours of his weekend sat on her bed in silence. This is a pattern investigators have a name for now. Coercive control does not usually announce itself with a raised fist. It arrives as attention that curdles into surveillance, as devotion that turns into a demand, as a slow closing of the space around a person until the world shrinks to one man's moods. It works because each single step looks small. Only when you stand back and see the whole staircase does the shape of it become clear. Molly's friends were standing back. Molly was still on the stairs. She tried to explain what she needed. She wrote that they could not be together every hour of every day, that she felt pressured. He fired back with insults. She was taking him for granted. She was throwing his kindness in his face. And somehow, by the end of it, Molly was the one apologizing. Her friends were shocked. What they were watching had a name, even if none of them said it out loud yet. And by then, it was already deeper than any of them knew. When she made plans, he had an episode. A wave of depression that only he could feel, that only her cancellation could ease. He used her own struggles as a reason to stay glued to her side. He said she needed his support. He quit his job so he could be around her more. Everywhere Molly went, Joshua insisted on going too. Soon she was telling friends she could not take it anymore. Too demanding, too possessive, constant arguments. After several days in a row of him turning up at her door without warning, she told him it was over. And that was before she understood who she was dealing with. He flipped. The messages came without stopping. Please, do not break up with me. I will literally beg. One chance is all I'm asking for. I will do anything. Then, the tactic changed. He told her she was seeing it all wrong, taking it the wrong way, that the real problem was her anxiety, that she wasn't happy with herself. He even encouraged her to book a doctor's appointment, to get help for a problem he had invented for her. That is the quiet violence of gaslighting. It does not leave a mark. It moves the blame, inch by inch, off the person causing the harm and onto the person suffering it, until the target starts to doubt her own memory of what happened. It worked again. He talked her into believing the trouble lived inside her own head, and Molly took him back. For a while, it looked like it might hold. He was working again, at a window company now, and his colleagues saw a man with two faces, One bright and likable, the other dark, withdrawn, irrational. It was the second face that Molly kept ending up alone with. In April of 2017, they went together to a party for Molly's aunt's 60th birthday, over in Essex. All night the family watched Joshua stare daggers at her whenever she danced, even with her own cousins. Molly's mother, Joanne, was already in bed when a message came asking her to come to their hotel room. She found Joshua in a rage. He wanted her to look at videos he had been secretly recording of Molly during their arguments, filmed without her knowing, kept in case he ever needed something to use against her. Think about what that means. Even while they were still together, he was building a case against her, gathering ammunition, treating the woman he claimed to love as a future opponent. Joanne stood in that hotel room and thought, for the first time, that there was something truly wrong with this young man. Molly was thinking it too. She was ready to end it, but she told her family she wanted to give him one last chance. They had a holiday booked in Tenerife. Against her parents' advice, she wanted to go. Maybe away from everything, she thought. They could fix it. She lasted one day. From the island, she messaged home that she had made a mistake. She had thought this thing with Josh would pass, she wrote, but it hadn't. It was the worst thing ever. Help me. She came home certain. She no longer had feelings for him. All she needed, she told her mother, was the right moment and the right words to end it cleanly. That moment came on June 17th, 2017. It was meant to be a good night, a late celebration of her 23rd birthday with friends in Maidstone. They had been arguing over Messenger for days, but they agreed to set it aside for the evening. It did not last. Joshua slid into one of his moods, and this time Molly did not manage him or smooth it over. In the middle of the club, she told him it was finished. And Joshua lost it. He turned to her friends and shouted that she was finished with him. They remembered his face after the pure rage in it. It was the first time they had seen that side of him. It would not be the last. Here is something the specialists who study these cases will tell you, and it matters for everything that follows. The most dangerous moment in a controlling relationship is not while it is happening. It is the moment a woman leaves. Separation removes the one thing the controller values above all else, which is power over her. And for a certain kind of man, that loss is unbearable. The breakup is not the end of the danger. It is the start of it. His pleading came first, and when the pleading failed, he turned aggressive, so Molly blocked him. That was when he went public. He began posting messages built to humiliate her, aimed at the one thing she had rebuilt her life around. Molly, the fitness student, the health enthusiast, the young woman who blogged about looking after yourself, was smeared online as a drug abuser. He posted her private messages. He posted screenshots. He tagged her family so they could not miss it. "You are a cokehead," he wrote. "Have you been honest that you need to stop sniffing gear, even lying to your own mom?" Molly was blocked from his account, so she did not even see it herself until a cousin phoned to warn her. She was horrified. She had known he could be vindictive. She had not thought he was capable of this. On June 22nd, she and her mother printed all of it out. The texts, the posts, every screenshot. They walked into the North Kent police station and put it on the desk. And this is where a system that could have protected her began, quietly and repeatedly, to fail. An officer named Philpott took the case. With Molly and Joanne sitting in the room, he phoned Joshua and put him on loudspeaker. He warned him to stop or face prosecution. He ordered him to take the posts down. Joshua's voice filled the room. "I haven't done anything wrong," he kept saying. "I haven't done anything wrong." And then, finally, a line Joanne would never forget. "If you think I have, there's more to come." The officer tried to close it out. "We wouldn't want Molly to come to the station again about you, would we?" Joshua answered him. "Wouldn't we?" 2 words, a threat folded into a question. And still, the report written afterward found that what Joshua had done did not amount to a course of harassment and did not amount to a criminal offense. That phrase, course of harassment, is not decoration. Under the law in England and Wales, harassment is defined as a course of conduct, meaning behavior that happens on more than one occasion and that a reasonable person would recognize as causing alarm or distress. Molly had brought a folder full of exactly that. The behavior fit the definition on its face. What was missing was not evidence. What was missing was someone with the will to read that folder as the beginning of a crime rather than the tail end of a bad breakup. The next day, he walked into the station himself with his own complaints. Molly, he said, was spreading rumors that he was in trouble with the police, and it was damaging his reputation and his career. He was advised to cut all contact and, once again, to remove the posts. Study the move for a second. A man who has just been warned by police walks in the very next morning and reframes himself as the victim. That is not the behavior of someone who has understood a warning. It is the behavior of someone testing how far the line can be pushed. 2 days later, Molly was back on the phone to police. He had posted again. The incident was logged and passed to Officer Philpott, but Philpott was off duty now and would not be back for days. It would have to wait for his return. The paperwork moved at the speed of a filing system. Joshua did not. All the while, Molly was genuinely afraid. Her family printed photographs of Joshua and handed them to the neighbors, asking them to call if they saw him near the house. A family should not have to build its own early warning network, but that is what fear does when the official channels keep answering with a shrug. On June 27th, she took what turned out to be her last call from the police. On the surface, it was good news. Joshua had removed the posts. He explained he didn't want potential customers seeing them. It sounded like a man backing down. He was not backing down. Because 1 week earlier, Joshua had visited a couple of local hardware stores. In one, he bought a knife. In another, a pickaxe. Both were already sitting in his car. That detail matters enormously, and it will matter again at his trial, because a weapon bought a week in advance is not the mark of a man who loses control in a sudden moment. It is the mark of a man who has decided. He had found a way around Molly blocking him too. A woman he had kept in contact with after a single Tinder date agreed to befriend Molly across all her social media under new names and feed everything back to him. He told the woman a false reason for it. What it gave him was Molly's every move, her plans, her locations, delivered to the one person she was trying hardest to escape. The evening of June 28th was warm, the sun still hours from going down, when Molly posted a smiling selfie to Snapchat. She had already changed every username, closed old accounts, opened new ones, done everything you are supposed to do. Onto the photo, she added a few words about where she was headed and a little love heart. It had been a rough couple of months. She wanted a normal night with friends. They went to the Ship and Trades, a pub at the Chatham docks. They hadn't been there long when Molly went up to order food and came back looking, her friends said, like she had seen a ghost. Because she had seen Joshua sitting there with a Tinder date. Later, he walked past their table, making sure to catch her eye as he went. Understand what that was. It was not a coincidence he was there. He had been fed her plans by the woman watching her accounts, and he had chosen that pub, and he had chosen to walk past her table so that she would know he could reach her anywhere. That is a message with no words in it. It says, you cannot hide. Every locked account, every new username, every careful step she had taken to get away, he had just quietly stepped over all of it, in front of her, and smiled. Molly told herself it was an unlucky coincidence, but it shook her. She told her friends not to worry, that he was just some psycho, finished her drink, and left early. It was the last time her friends would see her alive. By 10 the next morning, she was at her gym, at the Chatham Dockside outlet, the same daily routine, filming a workout for her personal training course. The room was empty. She rolled out her mat and started. Minutes later, Joshua arrives. He takes the stairs 2 at a time. He reaches the open door, sees her, turns, goes back down, and then he turns around and walks in. That hesitation on the stairs is not doubt. It is the last check of a plan. He picks up a mat. He starts to stretch, right beside where she works. She catches him on her own video before she goes over to face him. She asks if he has been following her, why he is not at work. None of her business, he says. So she leaves the room for another part of the gym, and she starts sending messages. At 10 in the morning, she texts her mother. Mum, he's turned up at the gym and come next to me. Joanne calls her straight back and tells her to come home and to drive carefully. Molly texts her friend Amy Lee and sends a photo of Joshua on the mat beside her. Amy tells her the same thing. Go home, now. An hour later, Molly writes back. She thinks he has left. She is packing up her things and heading to her car. She gathers her equipment and starts walking out. He had left the gym, but he had not left the car park. Joshua had been driving slow circles around the lot, waiting for her to come out. Read that again and feel the cold of it. While Molly texted her mother that it was over and she was safe now, he was 10 yards away, engine idling, waiting for her to walk into open ground. At 2 minutes past 11, Amy sends one more message. He has no sense of what's normal. He is a freak. Just stay away from him now. Inside her black Citroen, Molly does not see him crossing the car park toward her. She does not see the knife. She looks up as he wrenches open the driver's door. Before she can even raise her hands, it begins. Here the record asks for restraint, and it will get it. What the evidence shows is a sustained, deliberate attack that did not stop until he was certain she could not survive it. Molly McLaren was 23 years old. The paramedics did everything they could. She was declared dead where she sat. When it was over, he stepped back, calm, his top marked with what he had done, and he waited by the car for the police to arrive. When they approached, he wiped his face and told them, plainly, that it was him they were looking for. "She's in the car," he said. "I've killed her." No panic, no flight. A man who had done exactly what he set out to do, and knew it. Miles away, Joanne waited. The drive home usually took Molly 15 minutes. The minutes stretched. Maybe traffic, she thought. She sent a message and heard nothing. Then a message came from one of Molly's friends, asking if she had heard about something happening at the Chatham dockside. Joanne went cold. She knew, instantly, before anyone had said a single confirming word, that something had happened to her daughter. Soon officers were at the door making it real. And then came the part no parent should have to do. Molly's father, Douglas, was working on a boat 100 miles off the coast of Senegal. Joanne had to reach him out there on the water and tell him their girl had been murdered. There was never a mystery about who. Joshua had confessed at the scene, standing beside the car. But a confession at the roadside is not the same as a conviction in a courtroom, and the case that followed was not really about what happened. It was about why, and about whether the law would hold him fully to account for it. Building that case meant assembling the whole of the previous months into a single, undeniable line. The timeline came together from her own phone and his, from the messages neither of them had deleted, from the pub, from the gym, from her final texts to her mother and to Amy. It came from her own workout video, the footage in which she had, without knowing it, recorded the man who would kill her an hour later. And it came from 2 receipts, a knife and a pickaxe, bought a week before at hardware stores, a purchase that turned the word murder into the word premeditated. The dockside carried its own silent witnesses. Cameras covered the gym building and the car park, and they had recorded the whole of that final hour, him arriving, him climbing the stairs and turning back and climbing them again, him leaving the room, then circling the lot in slow, patient loops, while Molly gathered her things and believed she was safe. Investigators could lay that footage against her text messages minute by minute, so that her mother's reply telling her to drive carefully sat on the timeline beside the exact seconds he was waiting for her to step outside. There was no version of events left to argue about. The pictures matched the phones, and the phones matched the bodies of 2 people, one of whom had spent months preparing for this, and one of whom had spent months trying to get away. The trial opened in January of 2018. Joshua Stimson pleaded not guilty to murder, not on the grounds that he hadn't done it, but on the grounds of diminished responsibility. That defense deserves a plain explanation, because everything hinged on it. Under the law, if a killer can show he was suffering from an abnormality of mental functioning that substantially impaired his ability to understand what he was doing or to exercise self-control, a murder charge can be reduced to manslaughter. The difference is not academic. Murder in England carries a mandatory life sentence. Manslaughter does not. So the whole trial narrowed to a single question. Was Joshua Stimson a sick man who could not stop himself, or a well man who chose not to? And that question came down to 2 psychiatrists who examined the same person and could not have disagreed more. There is one more thing worth knowing about how this defense works, because it shaped the whole contest. When a defendant claims diminished responsibility, the burden does not sit with the prosecution to disprove it. It sits with the defense to prove it, on the balance of probabilities, meaning they had to persuade the jury it was more likely true than not. So the 12 people in that jury box were not being asked whether Joshua was troubled. Almost everyone agreed he was troubled. They were being asked whether his defense had proven that his mind was so impaired that he could not be held fully responsible for driving a knife into a woman he had spent weeks hunting. That is a far higher bar, and the facts of his own planning kept knocking it down. For the defense came Dr. Saeed Majid, the lead forensic consultant at the hospital where Joshua had been assessed after Molly's death. He had diagnosed a severe case of borderline personality disorder. Joshua, he said, was suffering an abnormality of mental functioning. rooted in his illness and in the abandonment he had carried since his parents' divorce as a child. When custody went to his father, and he came to believe his mother had left him behind, he described a hypersensitivity to any kind of rejection. For the prosecution came Dr. Philip Joseph, and he took it apart. He saw no disorder that had stopped Joshua from understanding what he was doing, or that could excuse him from responsibility for it. What he saw instead was a man who was immature, vain, marked by narcissistic traits, and who showed no remorse at all for killing Molly McLaren. And the evidence sat squarely on the prosecutor's side. A man who cannot control himself does not buy a knife a week early. He does not recruit an informant to track his target's movements. He does not circle a car park in patient loops, waiting. He does not stop, wipe his face, and calmly announce what he has done. Every one of those acts required planning, and planning is the enemy of the loss of control story. The defense was asking a jury to believe that a campaign spread across weeks was the work of a man overwhelmed in a single moment. The facts would not bend that far. The jury did not need long. In less than 4 hours, they returned. For a case that had turned on competing psychiatric opinion, on the fine legal machinery of responsibility and impairment, 4 hours is almost no time at all. It suggests the jurors did not find the medical question as close as the defense had hoped. Joshua Stimson, guilty of murder. And then, at sentencing, the story widened, because the trial had already forced open a door onto his past. This was not the first time. 2 women who had known Joshua before Molly came forward to describe their own experiences, and both had ended in fear. Leah Hubbard had met him on a night out in Maidstone in 2016. They hit it off, met a few times. Then, before anything was even serious, he was already jealous, asking whether she'd be talking to other men when she went out. Days later, while she was at her grandmother's birthday, her phone lit up with his calls and texts, accusing her of lying about where she was. She ended it that same day. And a few nights after that, she woke at 2 in the morning to find Joshua inside her house. He said he'd been out and just needed to charge his phone. She warned him that if he ever did it again, she would call the police, and he never came over again. Instead, she began seeing him everywhere she went, watching her, until it ended with him spitting a drink in her face at a bar and being thrown out. But the older account was the one that should have changed everything. In 2013, Alexandra Dale went on a single date with Joshua after matching on Tinder. Afterwards, she told him, politely, that she just didn't feel a connection. She assumed that was the end of it. It was not. He bombarded her phone with threats, telling her he would fly out to where she was and drown her. He sent her a photograph of her own back garden, though she had never told him where she lived. He slashed the tires on her car after warning her there was a surprise waiting for her at home. He followed her on nights out, photographed her, sent her the pictures, and abused her for what she was wearing. Alexandra reported him to Staffordshire police 3 times across 2013. She told them she feared for her safety, and his behavior was never recorded as a crime. The investigating officer simply sent Joshua a text, telling him to stop. Here is the weight of it. Had that report been logged, as it should have been, it would have lived in the system. And when Molly walked into a Kent police station 4 years later with her own folder and her own fear, an officer checking Joshua's name would have seen it. They would have seen a man already reported 3 times for stalking a woman who rejected him. They would have seen a pattern instead of an isolated complaint. It might have changed how seriously her case was taken. It might have changed the whole arithmetic of the risk. Instead, a single text message from a single officer in 2013 meant that history did not exist on paper, and a young woman 4 years later paid for its absence. Alexandra, following the case from a distance, understood exactly how narrow her own escape had been. "This twisted individual made my life hell," she wrote, "and the police were informed and did nothing about it. This poor girl did the same, and still nothing." She said she could not even imagine what Molly's family were going through. At the sentencing, Judge Adele Williams rejected the idea of a personality disorder outright. What Joshua had, she said, was not an illness, but an issue with women. She told him plainly what he had done and why. "You were determined to punish her for finishing with you," she said. "You were seeking revenge." She named Molly as she was, 23 years old, beautiful and intelligent, and she named what was in front of her in that courtroom, a family whose grief and anguish was raw and apparent for everyone to see. She called him a highly dangerous young man who would pose a very considerable risk to women for a very considerable time to come, and said he should never be released for the sheer wickedness of his crimes. He was sentenced to 26 years. And it is worth being precise about what that number means, because it is not a countdown to a release date. A murder conviction carries a life sentence, and the 26 years is the minimum term, the least amount of time he must serve before he can even be considered for parole. Consideration is not release. When that day eventually comes, a parole board will weigh whether he still poses a danger, and the judge had already told the court, in plain language, that she believed he would remain a very considerable risk to women for a very considerable time. The life sentence, in the truest sense, is the one Molly's family received on the 29th of June. A number in a courtroom does not balance anything. Molly's family said as much in a statement after the sentencing. The verdict had brought them a small measure of comfort, they said, but nothing would take away the pain or let them come to terms with Molly being taken from them. They were serving, in their own words, a lifetime of pain, anguish, and loss. Some of that pain now sits inside the system that failed her. Kent police invited the Independent Office for Police Conduct to examine how the case was handled and the series of failings within it. Out of that came a change with Molly's fingerprints on it, whether her name is ever attached to it or not. Officers are now required to record stalking as a crime, not as a texted warning, not as a note that goes nowhere, not as a filing that waits for one man to come back on duty. It is a small, hard-won correction, written in the worst possible ink. And there is a reason to say all of this out loud, beyond the telling of one terrible story. The warning signs in Molly's case were not hidden. The jealousy before there was anything to be jealous of, the showing up uninvited, the invented illness used to manufacture guilt, the isolation from friends, the surveillance, the escalation the moment she left. These are not the private eccentricities of one man. They are a recognizable pattern, and they tend to run in the same order. The law itself has been trying to catch up to that pattern. Controlling or coercive behavior in an intimate relationship became a criminal offense in England and Wales at the end of 2015, an attempt to name in statute the kind of slow, cumulative domination that no single incident ever quite captures. The trouble is that a law is only as good as the officer who applies it, and a pattern is only visible to someone willing to look at the whole folder rather than the top page. Molly brought the folder. The law existed. What failed was the reading of it. If any part of this sounds like a relationship, your own or someone else's, the leaving is the dangerous part, and it is the part where support matters most. Reports should be logged. Patterns should be believed. That is the lesson the paperwork learned too late. And there is what her family chose to build out of it. The Molly McLaren Foundation carries her name forward, funding charities that educate, raise awareness, and support people affected by eating disorders, the very fight Molly had faced down in her own life and turned into a message of self-worth for others. Before Joshua, before any of this, that was who she was becoming. A young woman who had come through her own hard years and decided to spend her life telling other people to be kinder to themselves. That is the part of her that outlives the car park and the courtroom. Not how she died, what she was for. While Joshua Stimson sits in a cell, the last word was always meant to be hers. Molly left words of her own behind, written before her death, and those words belong to her and to the people who loved her, not to a case file and not to a killer. They are hers to keep, and so, in the end, she has the one thing he spent months trying to take from her. She has the final say.